From time immemorial, the sovereign nations have inhabited, protected, and preserved the land that is so-called Canada. We acknowledge this fact. The land we serve is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Chippewa. Reelworld's offices are in Toronto, which is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Kathy Wong. I'm Vice President, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Official Languages at Telefilm Canada. So really happy to be here. Lisa, nice to see you again. Amar, Kaydon, and Tanya. So great to be all here together. It feels like we're in a big family in this room. I'm flying in from Montreal, so really happy to be able to join this conversation. And an important conversation. I had the chance to receive a copy from Lisa, but of course took a moment to look into the report before coming here. And one of the things that really struck me was the importance of recognizing the systemic discriminations and barriers that still exist in our industry. Of course, from this report's perspective, we're talking about the challenges that BIPOC production companies and NGOs face in our industry daily. And I believe that it is our role to be able to not only support researchers like those, but also listen, learn, and see how we can be better partners and allies in this fight against racism in our industry. So really happy to be here. Really glad to see this report coming out. It's great work. REMC and Lisa, it's been a long run, to get there, and I know how much energy you've put into this work. And thank you also to Tanya and to Reelworld for allowing this moment to have this conversation. So I'll leave this conversation to Lisa, but thank you again and happy to be here.
Thank you, Kathy. We'll start with the land acknowledgement video and then we'll move on to the panel.
From time immemorial, the sovereign nations have inhabited, protected, and preserved the land that is so-called Canada. We acknowledge this fact. The land we serve is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Chippewa. Reelworld's offices are in Toronto, which is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit.
Thank you so much. So I'm Lisa Valencia Svensson. I've been a documentary producer and I'm currently managing director at Racial Equity Media Collective. And we're launching our report here with you today. And I want to bring up our panelists right away. Do you want to come up right away? Yeah, okay. So we've got Tanya, Kaydon, and Amar. And I realize they're going to sit for a bit while I talk about the report, but you can arrange yourselves. So what we'll do is I'll speak for a few minutes about the report itself. It is now available on our website in English, and the French language version will be coming out early next week. So I just want to walk us through. We've got some slides, and I'll walk you through some of the details of what we have found and our key recommendations. And then I think, more importantly, we'll bring life to the report, and we'll hear from Amar and Kaydon and Tanya, who have a lot of combined years of experience individually and then combined both working in production companies, producing content in Canada, and also running organizations that are trying to support all of us in this work. So that's, and then we'll have time for some questions and answers. So that's what we'll do. And I have a slide. So I wonder if I'll just move myself a little bit forward. Sorry, production managing here. There we go. And apparently this will move the slides forward. Yeah, that might be true. Oh, here we go. Oops. Thank you. So the reason that we decided to do this research and the report, and actually before I go any further, I started at Racial Equity Media Collective just this January, but there is another person who was very, very important to the research and writing of this report, and she's here, and her name is Elizabeth Mudenyo, and she's right over there, and could you please just stand up so that... So basically everything I'm going to tell you now is because of her doing many hours of really important conversation and research with a lot of different people from across the country across several months. So this is your work. You're just there. But thank you so much, Elizabeth, for all of that. So I think, as all of us are very aware, Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led organizations and companies in our screen sector, we are struggling. We've been struggling for a long time to sustain ourselves, to stabilize our operations. I am certainly no stranger to that in the documentary producing world. We have precarity, we have a lack of funding, we have access to distribution, to partnerships, and a lot of this, if we start to dive into it, is because of the effects of systemic racism on our work and on how the system works. We're all rather familiar with this. And I'm going to get used to moving slides forward. So that was the impetus. We wanted to, I mean, for some of us, I think when we're in it every day, we know this intrinsically, and yet there's such a value to trying to put together, really talking to a lot of people, bringing it together in a very concrete fashion so we can point at some very specific details of how this systemic racism works, and we can start to think about how we can push institutions to move us forward in different ways. So that was our hopes with the report. So we came to a number of, I'm going to walk fairly quickly through these, but a number of key observations about what's going on. And we'll start with production companies. We have a number of observations for those, and then on to nonprofit organizations in the screen sector. And each slide will have a key point. So this first one is talking about access to funding for company growth. Obviously, for many BIPOC-owned production companies, there are ongoing difficulties in accessing funding for productions. And then because you're not even properly getting your projects funded, trying to make some profit that you can then put into stabilizing your company, building your company, developing the next projects is so very difficult. And I will go somewhat quickly through this. You can certainly dive into it at length if you'd like to download the PDF from our website. There's also the reality that there is an exclusion from established networks. Well-established production companies with strong connections to funders and broadcasters repeatedly land licenses, commissions, and funding, whereas others who are not part of the established networks remain left out. And I think this is some of the core reality of our lives of all. So many of us have grown up and sort of day in, day out, who are we, our families, our communities connected to? Who are we not connected to? What rooms are we in? What buildings are we in? What events are we in? What gatherings are we in? What are we not? How does that slowly and carefully move forward into how all of the sectors, and certainly this screen sector, operate? It's very subtle stuff, but I think it's good to name it and to really start to tackle it, and to have, and many people are already trying to tackle this, but to really name it and not shy away from talking about it's sometimes who you know, and are you playing hockey on a team? Okay, yeah, I heard the noises there, so people know what I mean. Another factor for the production companies are, of course, limited budgets. So BIPOC producers who do gain funding often note that they were underfunded, forced to produce web content instead of TV content or feature films, or to produce feature films with micro budgets. And of course, I know Telefilm and other agencies and funders are, I think, identifying some of these problems very much and working to address them. Nonetheless, we didn't want to shy away from really, let's take an honest look at what's going on, because this then helps all of the institutions to figure out what very concretely can we do. Onward. So production companies also often face limitations on the genres and topics that will get funded. BIPOC creators will often be faced with systemic inequities that discredit and disregard marginalized identities, and that display an industry preference for a narrow range of genres and topics. And this compounds if you're female, if you're queer, if you're disabled, etc. I certainly know I've been a queer, female, Asian, short producer for a long time, and I know how that lands, and I know how that's worked. And I know that there is both the presumption that we only want to tell our stories, but then those are niche, but then we also want to tell them, but then we're not, like, it's just very convoluted. And I think a lot of us trying to create content over the years are very familiar with how that plays out in strained, like it goes in all directions at once. It's not just in one direction. And we just want to be able to do it all, I think. And I think that's fair. Then there's, this is an interesting one because it's not, once you're in producing and creating, I think you start to realize, do I own my intellectual property or not? And then the implications of owning your own IP or not start to play out as you're starting to operate, because so the challenge of raising sufficient funding for projects directly impacts BIPOC creators' abilities to maintain ownership of IP and creative control. Gatekeepers regularly have a preference for working with established, often white-owned production companies, and then BIPOC creators have no option but to work together with those production companies to access funding, distribution, or broadcast license. This is another one which is, it's tricky, because sometimes you will have a BIPOC creator that prefers not to run their own company, own their own IP, etc. So there needs to be breadth for all of the options, but when we look at it systemically, we find that on the whole, if you do have that really good ability to own your own IP, it just gives you more power in the marketplace and just in the sector as a whole, in the industry, to build, to grow, etc. Especially if you land that winning piece of content that just makes millions, then you're like, yeah, I'm so glad I own that IP. So that's a big topic and one that can be dived into at length, but we just wanted to make sure we captured that as well. There's also an issue with third language content. If we want to produce content in so-called third languages, we face barrier to accessing funding. There might be lack of broadcaster and funder interest in this, and there might be a mistaken belief that there's a limited audience for certain third language content. We know in our report, in the text of it, we do mention that Telefilm had made a recent envelope and programming shift on that front to allow for more of this. So again, it's not that none of this is being addressed in any way at all, but it's still good to name it. We also have, if we're wanting to tell stories outside of Canada, either because that's where our story is, or we're in co-production. Certainly for Indigenous communities, there are Indigenous communities around the world, and often the whole question of borders and what even is outside and inside of Canada is a whole huge issue on its own. So BIPOC creators commented they're frequently collaborating with foreign producers and creatives on stories set in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, regions where Canada doesn't have many international co-production treaties in place. And so the lack of specific funding tools in Canada in support of that will hinder many creators' ability to participate in the projects. And we know, we ourselves fielded a question from Department of Heritage officials a few months ago asking for our input into international treaty co-production. So there's a lot of movement within the system, but it is still slow, and it's just good to get the full picture. Finally, there's a lack of BIPOC decision makers throughout the industry. So there's a greater need for hiring, retention, promotion of BIPOC executives in organizations across the screen sector, specifically funding agencies and broadcaster decision-making roles. So yeah, it feels kind of grim, but at the same time, there's nothing like, you can't solve a problem until you really see what it is. And so this was just our attempt to really shine a spotlight on it. In terms of nonprofit organizations, and I think something like Reelworld, Screen Institute, and the film festival that you're running, BIPOC TV and film are prime examples. There's many others. They are also facing constraints, and these are the organizations that so many of us rely on to fund us, to show us, to give us awards, to help build our careers, so forth and so on. So we wanted to include them a little bit in this research as well. So they face low budgets, and I'm going to go a little bit more quickly now. Forgive me for not diving into these slides so much, because I want to get to you guys. And you can really find all of this. These are direct quotes from the report, so you're not missing anything. There are low budgets for the organizations themselves. There's a lack of operational funding. Often it's project funding, and anyone who has tried to run a nonprofit organization in the arts, you know what it is to get that operational funding grant, which just means, oh, we can relax, versus we have to think of another project, because then we're going to carve out operating money from the project running budget. It's just an endless dance. And then there's insufficient human resources often, because a low operational budget means it's hard to hire staff and retain staff and build people up. And so I'm skipping a little bit there. We had key takeaways. These are also direct pulls from the report. For production companies, we want that funding be offered to support the stabilization of emerging and mid-level companies, capacity building programs. We'd like targets through community consultations for broadcasters to license BIPOC content. That's specific for TV. We'd like more money earmarked and invested into BIPOC content development and production without requirements for broadcast triggers. That's, again, TV. And then we'd like access facilitated to low interim financing that's targeted for BIPOC companies. Again, anyone who's tried to actually cash flow anything immediately understands how awful a process that is and how much interim financing at low interest rates can make or break you. Finding ways to incentivize rather than penalize content in third languages, creating a funding program to allow BIPOC creators to invest in non-treaty co-productions with countries in the global south, and hiring more hiring more BIPOC talent into senior decision-making roles. Some of the takeaways are, kind of obvious results of the findings that we had. And last but not least, for nonprofit organizations, having targeted funding programs to support operational funding again, having more outreach and communication to BIPOC organizations from funders about funding opportunities, ensuring that funding applications are adjudicated by BIPOC staff, or peer-reviewed juries. That's another devil is in the details situation for many of us face. And final slide, and then we'll get to the way more interesting. Oops, not the final slide. Okay, there we go. Collaborate with funders who are offering similar funding streams so that there can be shared application forms and reporting. Because we all know what it is to have to churn out 10 versions of an application and a report versus one. Investing in the training and development of BIPOC arts administrators and leaders, and finally investing in capacity building programs and supports for BIPOC organizations. So again, I'm going a bit quickly because it is there for you to dive into at length. And what I'd love to do now is let's dive into what this really looks like and what this experience has been for a few people. So I'd like to move now to our panel. Hello, guys. And I'll move the table back. I'll just stage manage for a moment again here. And get the slide. There we go. I can do it all somehow. Almost. And so now I'd like to have, thank you, our panel, if you guys can each briefly introduce yourselves and what you do, and then we'll dive right in. Maybe we'll start with you, Kaydon.
Oh, this is so convenient. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Kaydon Douglas, Executive Director at BIPOC TV and Film.
Great, thank you. And Amar?
Hi, everybody. I'm Amar Walla. I'm a filmmaker and producer, and I run a company called Scarborough Pictures.
And Amar's being a little bit not fully saying because he's one of the founding board members of Racial Equity Media Collective. So without his tireless work, along with the other two founders, Shreen Barsoom and Tamar Dawit, we wouldn't be here like this today. So thank you.
And hi, is this on?
Is it?
Oh, that is not on. It's not, because I haven't switched it on. You didn't tell me that part. I'm Tanya Williams. I'm the founder and executive director of Reelworld Screen Institute, of which Reelworld Film Festival sits under the umbrella of.
Yes. And not to just gush too much, but I think for many of us, I started in the industry maybe 2005, 2006, and Reelworld was already existing. And so Tanya and your organization and all the staff that have come through have really been a bit of a pillar, I think, for a lot of us and I see heads nodding, here in the Canadian screen sector. And there's other people who have been pillars. And I think it's always good to sort of mention and honor that.
Because I forgot to say it's our 22nd year this year, yes.
All right, so we'll start with you, Amar, because you are actively running a production company and you have been for a while. And so you're so familiar with a lot of the experiences that we've detailed and focused on in the report. Can you just give us a little bit of the story of what it has been like to try to start and then grow a production company and grow your career with all of this and anything else?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I started off mainly as a director in the documentary world. After my first feature premiered at Hot Docs, I was kind of in a situation a lot of first-time filmmakers are in which I was getting a lot of sort of critical acclaim and winning awards, and all of that looked great, but I was completely broke at the time, right? And
2014, right? Just to put time frames on all of this. Okay.
And so basically what I needed to learn after that was how to make money in the industry as a filmmaker. And so I started directing episodic work on the documentary side, and essentially, leading up to 2018, 2019, I started to realize that I was really only ever working for white-owned production companies. And a lot of the work that I do is around issues of race and migration. Those stories started to become more important or more sought after by the industry, but it was still those same white-owned production companies that were getting to tell those stories and hiring people like me. But I was never really in control of the stories, and never really in control of how those stories come together and how we put them out into the world. And so I just felt like there needed to be more production companies owned by people of color who were telling these stories now that these stories were becoming a commodity in the industry. And so Scarborough Pictures was kind of just there for a while as my holding company to kind of loan out my services as a director.
And let's ask, when did you first incorporate? Just so we have, comparative.
I've always produced my own work. So Scarborough Pictures in some capacity has existed since 2009. I started calling it Scarborough Pictures, I think, in 2015. So, and I really called it that because while Scarborough right now is having this sort of moment and renaissance, back then, if I can be frank, no one was messing with Scarborough, and it really needed to be, I really wanted it to be like a signal to the industry of who I was making work for. So, but a couple of years ago, I came across a really amazing web series called Next Stop, which was, doing really well on YouTube and Twitter, and it was made by a group of young filmmakers from Toronto and it was really kind of resonating with the Black artistic community here in Toronto in a way that it was something I'd never really seen before. And so sort of a long story short, I began working with those filmmakers and produced the second season of Next Stop for CBC Gem. And that was the first time Scarborough Pictures had produced something for someone else that was not my own work. And since then, I'm working with the same team again, and we're now doing a doc series. And so we've started to become sort of like a functioning production company that can support other creators. It's been very eye-opening to see some of the major hurdles and some of the difficulties in actually building a company, but it's also been really eye-opening to see how a lot of the stories you hear about how difficult it is are just not true, and really a form of gatekeeping to keep us from really building our own companies, because ultimately our stories have definitely become commodified in the industry, and if that money is going to flow anywhere, it needs to flow back into our communities, not into the communities that have already been benefiting from the film industry. So.
Yeah, I've sat recently and thought about how many careers in the screen sector in Canada and elsewhere in the world have been built on Black, Indigenous, and people of color stories, but we're not part of it. We're actually so crucial. And it's really, if we take control of our stories more, I think there's a profound strength to that and power to that. And I think in some ways we're just beginning. In some ways we've made a lot of steps, but let's reach much, much farther. Amar, I want to ask you more a little later about maybe one of the key one or two issues or roadblocks or whatever that you've experienced, because I think it'll be really interesting to compare to what was found in the report more broadly. I'm going to move to you, Kay Don. And you've been executive director of BIPOC TV and Film for the past almost 2 years, but the organization is older. If you could just, I'm sure most people here are quite familiar, but just a quick overview of it, and then just talk to us about the work and what the report is capturing, how that's resonating for you.
Sure. So BIPOC TV and Film has existed since 2012, when it started really as a community network support group, really grassroots in its nature, built on how are we going to support each other and build our own network, since we've been locked out of, sorry, my throat was fine before, that we've been locked out of the established networks, and we all know that. So how do we galvanize support for ourselves, for each other, and to build solidarity amongst our different racial and ethnic groups? in I joined the organization or started coming out to meetings around like 2017, 2018. When I joined what Natalie just put together as a visioning committee after running it for so many years, mostly with her and with Shona Foster, getting a lot of things off the ground. And at that time, we're thinking about how do we steer this? How do we create actionable change? How do we continue supporting our community and building out the infrastructure for that? After so many years of people volunteering their time, endless hours, we know, I'm sure a lot of you know how exhausting it can be when you're pushing against a system that has not been designed to accommodate you. I really saw the burnout amongst like our most active volunteers and visioning committee members. And we decided to take the step in incorporating the organization, deciding that we do have to have paid staff who could take on this work full time as an organization. One of the key things then was really seeing how do we step into and grow into what a lot of people know as a nonprofit industrial complex, while retaining our roots as an organization as well. So that's just in terms of our journey from grassroots organization to nonprofit. So we became a nonprofit in October 2020, so it's been 2 years of that. And Natalie had the crazy idea of asking me to come on board and to steer it into this new chapter. And there are significant challenges in not only operating a nonprofit arts organization, but in building one itself. There isn't really, I don't really know of any like startup funding for these types of movements. I don't know about, there's hardly any cooperating, especially when you're just starting out as well. I know a lot of we're asked to create all of these projects, all these programs instead, until we are seen as, until we're deemed worthy of an investment in building up our capacity. But what was beautiful at the end of 2020 was the CMF launched their sector development fund and provided an opportunity for some of our organizations to get that seed funding so we could establish ourselves. The challenge with that is that that was a one-year opportunity for us. So it's what's next? Okay, so a lot of us got the money to either scale up or to establish ourselves, but what comes after that? We saw that it really dried up in terms of access to cooperating funds. And that's why you see so many of us creating programs. You know, we're in a mad rush to create these programs. That's how we get the funding, so then we could feed that into our other work, into our advocacy. And one of the major challenges that I see, which I fully believe is by design, I am a bit of conspiracy theorist, but I think there's truth in it, is that because of all of the work that we have to do, the administration of nonprofit organizations, chasing funding, especially cooperating, thinking about how are we going to hire and retain staff, pay them a livable wage, us being concerned with all of that, we're not getting time to focus on the advocacy and the systems change work. So that's a huge, and I noticed that last year after a few months of just going at it, I'm like, whoa, we're not doing advocacy as we used to before, you know, because we're so tired doing the other work. So how do we find a balance in this? And then just my thing is like thinking about why our organizations exist is because of the systemic and the structural barriers that have been created, you know, that we have been pushed to create our own spaces as well. And if it's the system that has caused it, the system should be investing into our growth and development.
Thank you, Kadon. And just, yes. I like there's periodic sounds of acknowledgement, which are really satisfying, I have to say. Thank you. Kadon, just for those who aren't completely already aware, BIPOC TV and Film runs a database of crew,
yes.
And you also provide training and mentorship and any other key program area you want to.
Great.
Quick.
Thank you. We work on several levels. One, in terms of community building and engagement. That's the core of who we are. I say already, the community is my highest priority, that we maintain that trust and we build it. Next is in terms of professional development and access to training, to any type of talent development, so then our community members could build their own capacity. And and that ties in with Hire BIPOC, which is the platform that we have, where employers could be connected to BIPOC talent from across the country. And that's been great. We've been running that for about 2 years now, and the growth has been immense. And also the interest from industry has been great as well. And then lastly, in terms of the advocacy and that systems change that I talk about, and really holding our industry accountable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And last but certainly not least is Tonya and Reelworld. Why don't you begin by just giving us the summary of 22 years, and just listing. We're all very familiar with the festival. We're probably very familiar with also the data. You guys also have a crew database and funding and mentorship. But over to you.
Thank you. I think I'll even before I start with Reelworld, I'll just say briefly, I also have a production company called Wilbo Entertainment. And in 2003, I was producing and directing a project for Vision Television. And I think that was my first journey into not having like-minded people from my community to be able to work with, that they're always putting you with white people that are telling you what your story is. In 2004, I had pitched a gospel special to CBC, and immediately they just surrounded me by a bunch of white people that did not know anything about what I actually wanted to do. And one of the black people that I brought on to be an associate producer, they literally argued with me. They didn't want to give her this credit. They didn't want to make her associate producer. And it was just, the whole experience was so unpleasant. It didn't make me want to produce something after that. And when you talked earlier about IP and owning IP, I didn't even really want to own the IP, because what ends up happening is everyone wants their pound of flesh. Everyone wants money, and you end up losing, because I was like losing money on the project because they bring all their friends and their lawyer friends who are their brothers and their relatives and whatever. And you actually feel you're alone. You have no people that you think can sort of support what you're actually doing. So I found the experience very challenging, and that experience has helped me shape some of the things that I have done at Reelworld since then. So Reelworld for me started because my success started in Canada in the late 70s, and I was like the one success. It wasn't even like there was an open door. It was like the door open and shut, and I happened to slip through, and I knew I was fortunate. It wasn't that I thought, oh, this is how things work. I knew that I was fortunate, and when I was on sets, I was the only person of color, of any color, by the way, in front of or behind the camera. And though that went on for a good, 10 years, you wouldn't even find drivers or any crew people. Like, there were no people of color. I think it's hard to imagine what that felt like at that time. And after 10 years of being in Canada, and what everyone was saying, wow, you book everything. That's what they were telling me. And I was going, I'm not even making a living. How am I booking everything? So that was my beginning in 87, making that move to Los Angeles, and was like night and day. I was surrounded by people of color, and they were all talking about how unfair it was. And I was like, you don't know what unfair looks like. You actually can see people, here on the crew. So coming back to Canada, because I loved coming back and speaking at groups and trying to get the industry going here, I saw a shift. Everyone was just asking me, how do I get to the US? How do I get to LA? No one was asking, how do I make it in Canada? Because to them, it was like, that's a pointless question. Why even bother ask that question? And that was what made me want to start this. I'd been going to the Toronto International Film Festival since I was 17. That was back in the 70s. And I thought that was the biggest thing that made a growth for my career. Going to that festival, not knowing anyone, sitting in the line, talking to some guy who was a cinematographer, talking to some other person who said there was a casting director. Those are the relationships that moved my career forward. And that's 90% of your success in this industry, are the relationships you're going to build. You're not building them at the time thinking, oh, this is going to be my relationship to success. You're just building people you're talking to. Somebody tells you about an audition somewhere, or a producer somewhere, or a funder, although no one ever tells me about a funder anywhere. But you hope someone tells you about these things. And so a film festival is the one thing that I really wanted to create, because I thought, I had the vision of it in my mind. I saw all these people, Black people, Indigenous people, Asian, South Asian, Middle East. I saw all these people together, pushing together. I just felt that there wasn't the population for us to push alone in our own groups. There wasn't enough of a black population to create a black anything. There wasn't enough of an indigenous anything just to make it indigenous this. But together we had some power. So that was the beginning of gathering the people together. And they were, I knew nothing about putting a film festival on. I mean, I threw myself into something, but I am tenacious. That's, no one says that. And I don't know, stop. I just keep digging. And I hope I hit like oil at some point, but I just keep digging and digging and digging. And I think what I didn't realize was how hard it would be to hire people to work at Reelworld. Forget, you think it'll be, finding the content and the filmmakers and the programs. Before you even get to that, you're like, there are no people of color that know marketing or arts administration. So all of a sudden, the plan had to be that Reelworld was a training ground for people to do sponsorship and marketing and all those things. And then we pushed them out into other organizations. So we got people jobs after they worked at Reelworld at Hot Docs. Programmers, there were no programmers. Cameron Bailey and I would sit and go, there's like no people of color who are programmers. So we had to train programmers and then get them working at TIFF and get them working at other festivals. So that was a big part of what Reelworld. And to just remind you how unsupportive when you see people who are a success, like Amar, like Kadon, a success, there might be the misconception of, they've had the support and they wake up in the morning and there's this. No, it's like you are hitting a brick wall every day, all the time. And that's my norm. I don't expect the road. Forget even easy. I don't even expect there to be a road. I just keep pushing through the bush until something happens. And no, why did I say that now? I lost my own train of thought. But you say that because as I was going through that and just trying to make space, you've got people, that's where I was going with this. They don't even understand what you're doing. So I started Reelworld to a loud noise from the white community of, why are you stirring up trouble, Tanya? Because I was working in the industry, so I knew a lot of the players already. So I was ahead of the game. And they were like, why are you doing this? We don't have a problem. You're bringing those U.S. things here. They have a problem in the U.S., but we don't have a problem in Canada. And I would just go, look around your office. You have only white people working in your office. Look at your board of directors on your website. Look at the staff, look around you. And it was like, I can only say like a white blindness is what I call it. It was like they really didn't register till you actually pointed it out that no one was there. And I still find that shocking. Like, how do you not see people are not there? But the TV shows that were on TV didn't show people there, so you kind of grew up with the sense of these people weren't really here. Maybe that's part of it. But Reelworld had, and the criticism, that's the other thing, from grants officers. Tanya, you've got so much turnover at Reelworld. That was like a criticism. I'm like, you don't understand, that's a compliment. We're turning over because we're the only training place and we want to push them out. We want them working in other places. So it's what we talk about when we say there's a colonial way of looking at things, and then there's a way that we're doing things. And the way that our community is doing things is we're building and growing in a way that white communities didn't have to think about. When I started my career as an actress, I remember my agent saying, you do things that none of the other actors do. And I go, I don't have the luxury of doing things like all the other actors are white. I'm one black person that's in this agency, and no casting directors are even trying to hire black people or even bring them in for an audition. So I think we have to chart our own course. I think it's not about looking about what has already been done. I think we're feeling our way through things. Where I feel lucky is I invested $300,000 of my own money in starting Reelworld, or it would never have started.
Well,
and
there's
everyone here, I'm sure, has put in, you have to put in your own money.
Yeah.
And you can't complain about that. That's just the way it is. But when you talked about creating the programs or creating things for money, I went through 10 years of a sponsor giving me $5,000 when I wanted to say, like, shove your 5K. Honestly, I put in $300,000, you're putting in $5,000. I mean, and I had to be grateful and humble and say, oh my God, thank you so much. But inside it was killing me.
Yeah.
Like, you could easily give me $100,000. Why would you give me 5K? So I had to earn and crawl up for each dollar
Yes.
on the way up.
Well, I think this speaks to there's so many. Can you hear me? Yeah, this is on. Okay, somehow it sounded off for a second. I think the strategies we all use are we're thinking of them off the top of our heads every day. We're getting very familiar with pouring that concrete for the road, basically, even though we didn't want to become concrete experts. And I think there's also a lot of the training people up, and I think we all always have that obligation to be constantly mentoring and apprenticing each other. I'm struck by the fact that in 2015, I was one of the few voices babbling on in the documentary world about these issues at the time, and openly. And Kadon, Hot Docs hired me to be a mentor for a mentorship program. And Kadon, you were in the first.
Yeah, diverse voices.
Diverse voices. And I remember saying to all of you, it's like, okay, here's the thing. I need you to join me in this industry as quickly as possible to help me, because I'm really lonely and I'm tired. I think everyone in that program took that to heart, and I think a lot of other people did. And I think that's how we're building it. Like, we're not just, we'll just go down this usual path. It's like strategy every time. I'd love to hear a little bit more. When we were sort of having a prep conversation for this panel, Amar, you had been talking about how, the film festivals and the organizations are so crucial to the creators, and that was a really interesting point to think through the synergy going on between the different types of groups that you guys represent. So I wonder if you have questions for each other, or if you want to talk a little bit about how important the non-profit screen sector organizations are for production companies and producers. And
Sure. I mean, I can start it off by talking about it from the perspective of just being a filmmaker. And, a lot of the work I do is very specific to Canada, and it's very specific to issues of race in Canada. And I, didn't realize when I was a younger filmmaker coming up that they were anti-racist films. I was just making films about things I cared about or topics that were really bothering me, and I felt like artistically I was compelled to make these films. Well, those films can get you a lot of sort of cultural credibility and support from your community, but the larger industry doesn't value those films in the same way, right? But festivals like Reelworld value those films, and I've played films at Reelworld multiple times, and what I think is changing now, and it's I think Tanya used the word colonial, which I think is a very apt phrase, but for a long time you could only get guaranteed funding or automatic funding if your films had played certain festivals. And I feel like in Canada, especially as a younger filmmaker, I was checking off all of the boxes, right, in terms of what my films were doing. But the list of films was like Berlin and Cannes and all of that stuff, and I'm like, I mean, it'd be great. I don't have the money to apply to all those anyway, but it's also not who I'm making work for. And why would we want a programmer in Germany or France determining which Canadian filmmakers should be getting automatic financing for their next films? And so I think it's important now that those lists have grown, and Telefilm Canada has started to have a BIPOC development stream, which includes festivals like Reelworld and Real Asian and other local festivals, which now opens up the door to a lot more producers and a lot more filmmakers of color from Canada. But if it wasn't for, I think the biggest thing that things like BIPOC TV and film do, and Reelworld does for someone like me, is give me a sense of community, right? And that's a really kind of vital thing. When you don't have access to the industry, when you don't have access to pools of money, but you have community, you can still push and you can still get things done and you can still make your work. And there's a sense that like we're all in it together, which I think is really important when you are trying to make work in this industry, because it can get, as you noted, very lonely very quickly. And so, pre-pandemic especially, and I think the pandemic made it really difficult for us, but like getting together at Hot Docs, getting together at Reelworld, getting together and talking about things is what recharged us year after year to keep doing this work and keep trying to change the industry, right? So I think that's why this sort of collaboration between the people making work, the people programming work, the people training people, all of this is really important. And I will say that moving forward, what happened with the pandemic and the quote unquote racial reckoning and the fact that, we were able to make such strides so quickly over the last couple of years, that was a very unique set of circumstances that allowed that to happen. That is not the default setting of the industry. And as things go back to normal, quote unquote, the industry will try to snap back to its original roots, right? It's built a certain way. It's not built to actually do these things. And so I think there's incredible people on the inside of those organizations pushing to make these changes permanent. I think there's organizations and filmmakers on the outside doing that work. But now is the crucial time for Reelworld, BIPOC TV and Film, REMC, to be properly financed so that they can continue to do work day to day, so that I can go back to making films and producing stuff, right? Because I can't do that full time for 2 years anymore. I was able to do it when we slowed down, but this is why we're so lucky to have, people like my co-panelists and you, Lisa, actually leading this charge. Because fundamentally, the industry is not built to do this work. Right? And those changes are going to take a very long time to cement themselves.
Keidon, I see you nodding in different ways. I'd love to hear more, in the almost 2 years, and you started during the pandemic, as have I, so it's weird to try to gauge how is our work impacting anyone, because we never see them. But you're seeing people more and interacting. What are you feeling like the biggest thing is that BIPOC TV and film is providing to people, either in a general way or very specific ways? It'd be good to hear about that.
It's community
as well. Okay.
What I often hear about feedback in our programming is that people feel cared for and they feel safe. And that's how I want people to feel in the wider workforce as well. I want people to go to work, they feel like they could be themselves, they could feel safe in that space. They don't have to think, oh my gosh, I have to deal with Suzanne's microaggressions today, and have to deal with that for the entire time, or I don't want to deal with this nonsense, because that affects how you show up in your job. It affects you psychologically, how you move up the ladder as well, and what opportunities are presented to you, how quickly we are labeled as problematic. We have to look at that. That's all part of it. So I want people to feel the same way as they feel through our programs or working for a different organization, that they feel that same sense of safety in the rest of the industry. So that's been the main part, and people just liking the intentionality of the programming too. And that's because the people who are designing it are the people who've been through that, or we have the lived experience of it. So we're like, what would we love? The showrunner catalyst that we're doing in collaboration with the CBC and CFC, Natalie is she's in the middle of all of that, and
Natalie
she created
Younglai, the founder.
Natalie Younglai, and she really helped us shape that program. Just thinking about what would she have liked coming up as a writer, as a senior writer, what would have helped to prepare her for the role of a co-EP. So that's why the programming could be so intentional, because we have people who've actually lived it and not people who are thinking about it theoretically. I read a book and, let's do it now. So all of that built into it. I want to just talk about the point about turnover and how our organizations are evaluated as well. So it's very hard to get core staff. It's very hard to get and to retain core staff, because you want amazing people, okay? But you can't afford to pay them, because you're a nonprofit organization with limited access to funding, limited access to donors as well. So that is so usually you will have an executive director who's working hardly ever full-time, sometimes just part-time and juggling other jobs as well. I'm fortunate that I'm able to do this job full-time. But I know that a lot of my peers don't have that privilege. So you have that already. So you have an executive director, which I saw somebody say that we are professional generalists. Like we have to be professional, we have to know everything, we are the CEO, the CFO, the CTO, the CIO, we're all of it in the organization. So that's one part of it. Then you have to bring in staff and think, okay, if you want to really build strong programming, really strong relationships with your community, build your impact, you need to have consistent staff. You would love to have that, especially at the senior level. You need that type of consistency across the board, especially if you're doing a 3 to 5 year strategic plan. You would love to have that. Now, again, it's really hard for you to have somebody who is full-time doing that, paying them a livable wage. And the livable wage in Toronto right now is $22.08 per hour, okay? So let's just think about it, paying somebody, and that's supposed to be like the lowest, like just thinking about the person who earns the least in the company. So you're thinking about hiring somebody who's making like $40 an hour, $30 to $40 an hour to do this job. Can you afford that then to have consistent core staff for your organization? The nature of funding right now, the funding ecosystem, is that we're majorly funded for programs, projects. And out of that, we could maybe say, okay, well, we have a small amount that we could hire someone, but we'll only be able to hire them on a contract basis, seasonally or part-time. How does that allow us to really grow in the way that we need to? So if we have core funding, then we could really strengthen ourselves as organizations. If we're still able to, yes, we get program funding. So yes, we could hire somebody extra to support a specific program. Like say, for instance, we need somebody for episodic lab who could just focus on that one alone. We can do that, and that's a short contract, but we have somebody at the director level, at the manager level, who works year-long with the organization. So these are like some of like the nitty-gritty issues that have like really large impact for us. And that's what keeps me up at night, other than the rampant racism in this industry. But like that's in terms of how do I retain my staff? How do I maintain a positive cash flow as an organization so we could do the work that's necessary, that we could undo the harm that's been done by this system?
Indeed, these are big questions, and it can feel kind of overwhelming, but I think at the same time, if I think back, like we weren't having this type of report funded by Telefilm. We weren't having a 22-year-old organization where there's this type of industry session where we're meeting. We weren't having BIPOC TV and film. We weren't having Scarborough Pictures 10 years ago. And we've built a lot, and I think maybe what we're still all feeling is we could get so much farther, and we're not there yet. I think that's actually a sign of our strength, because we're ambitious.
As you say that, though, I do want to say they were here before 10 years ago.
Yes.
I don't mean Reelworld. I mean before Reelworld.
Right.
I mean BIPOC. Black Video Film and Network was around forever.
Let's name them.
This is what Amar was, like you have these growth, and then there'll be a shrink,
right,
and these things happen. There were lots of, I sat in University was around for 10 years before. Well, yeah, Black Video Network. Yeah,
we have a host from Black TV in the audience.
We've had 4 Black film festivals since the 80s. Come and die. Come and die, come and die. So I've seen that arc. So for some of you who've come up in the last 10 years, it feels like we've made all this progress. But we've been saying that since 1977. That's when I started saying it. But they were the Claire Prados before that talked about organizations before even 1977. So it just shows you that we don't really archive or keep our history. It's not in our culture sometimes, and it's not sustainable even. And so there's always this feeling that we're starting from scratch every 10 years, and we're not going to get that momentum and be able to move forward.
Okay, thank you for that, Tonya. I speak as someone who started 15 years ago, so I'm just feeling what I didn't have then. Thank you. Let's open up. We have a few minutes left, and I know that Sophia has a microphone in her hand, and we'd love to, if anyone has a comment, a question, a thing they just needed to pour out already, we're happy to just commune. Yes, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you all for
That's
being
a real world programmer.
Oh. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Aisha.
Hi.
I'm a Virgo. I enjoy long walks on the beach. My question kind of pertains to when we talk about equality in the industry. Once upon a time, in or around 2020, I took it upon myself. I was like, I was programming at Reelworld, and it was so hard to find a feature film directed by a Black person. And I was like, why is this? And so I spoke to all kinds of people. I still have my notes. I was like, I'm going to write an op-ed and change things. And then I never did. But I was talking to a senior producer who had produced all kinds of things. And I was asking him, like, he had had screened at Berlinale and Cannes, and I was like, what do you think about the industry when it comes to equity, that kind of thing? And he had said, these streams for like Black, Indigenous people of color are great. However, I do think that in some regard, they are a kind of sideways distraction where it keeps us from actually getting at the main pie. And he's like, it's so great, and it is a step in the right direction. But I'm curious on how we can make, instead of a separate pie, how can we make the pie more accessible for all people? And then to bring your kind of attention to, like, once upon a time, there were these letters where a bunch of producers that were predominantly white were like, we are upset. They were upset about public money being like, we don't think that they should have access to it because this is how we float our businesses. And there was kind of like a weird thing for a moment. And so I guess I'm curious when it comes to all of you and what you've seen in the industry. Obviously, programs like this are amazing because I feel very supported as a filmmaker. However, I'm curious about the whole separate pie thing. Do you think, because there are advantages and disadvantages, but also lots of advantages. So I'm just curious about, like, how do you think we can make the entire pie more accessible? And do you think in some regards, then people can be like, okay, well, we have this program and we've given it for like women and people of color and like they get access to $100,000, great. But like the big players will still vie for the $1 million. So I'm curious about that. Does that make any sense?
Total sense. I'm literally bizarrely paid to think about that every day, and I do, and in great depth, and hopefully we'll have more to be telling you all about in the months to come on that front. Getting access to the main pie without question. Let's go over to the panelists.
Well, that pie needs to be divided in 1,000 ways as far as I'm concerned. I don't think in my lifetime there'll be one pie and we're all going to eat fairly from it. So I don't have that as any kind of an illusion in my head. Right now, there's a pie called diversity. I've been living with that pie since the early 80s. That pie's unfair because normally people carved out 5-10% for what they call diversity. And diversity was every single human being that was not a white straight man. So if you were a white gay man, you were diversity. If you were a white straight woman, you were diversity. If you're a veteran, you're a diversity. I think you're a pregnant woman, you're diversity. So everyone was fighting for 5-10%, and white straight men got 90% of the pie. So I think when the pie is 99% diversity, I'll go, oh, there might be some fair. And then the other thing that it's just such another illusion is all diverse people play nice together. All diversity, we're all kumbaya and work together. So once we get our pie, we'll all share it out equally, whatever. There's so much racism between diverse groups. So, people carve out what they need for Black people, and South Asian people carve out what they need for South Asian people, and Asian people carve out so Indigenous people are carving out what they need. So then you've got this weird dynamic happening because there's not enough money for everyone to begin with, and now we're fighting, to try and get the little piece of that pie. And then let's just say the piece of that pie was Black. Then you've got Caribbean Black people. Then you've got African Black people. Then you've got, Canadian Black people. Then and we're all fighting for that piece of that pie of whatever that is. And then if you're African, then you're Nigerian, and then so it's like it's all set up for us to just bicker and to quarrel and to fight and to not move forward, but it was set up that way.
Yeah.
So
thank you. Yes, I'm loving this feedback up here. It's the best.
Sister.
Amar.
I can speak about it from sort of what's practically happened in the industry over the last couple of years, because there have been, for a long time there were no BIPOC quote unquote funds, right? And now they've started to creep up a little bit. I think the separate pots work really well if the main pot is also divided up representationally. And what I mean by that is, if it's just a separate pot, that will create ghettoization of our stories. We'll only be able to apply to those smaller pots of money, and that'll create sort of the competitiveness and infighting that Tanya's talking about. Those BIPOC only pots are supposed to be supplementary. They're supposed to make up for the years of inequality that we've been facing, right? So they only work if the main pot is also going to a lot of people of color, and then those people of color can get at the supplementary pots to make up for, because I can use Telefilm or CMF for an example. Once you get that money, you're still going to face a whole bunch of other barriers from other parts of the industry, right? When you go to the bank for your interim financing, they don't treat you like they treat a white producer. So all of that is going to come back at you. That's where those supplementary funds are supposed to help, right? They're supposed to make up for all the other barriers you're going to face. Now, if you only have the supplementary funds, what that essentially means is the few people that have been lucky enough to break through, and there's very talented people of color from different communities that have broken through over the years, it is basically going to entrench their position in the industry because they're going to be able to access all this extra money. And it's going to ensure that they're the only ones that stay in the industry. And then the industry will use them to point to, hey, look, things are going well for this person, right? And this is why REMC, this is why data is so important. This is why everyone should be constantly requesting numbers from Telefilm to CMF, CBC, everybody, because we need to know how is that money being split up, which communities are being left behind, because this is not going to be the type of work where you get to a certain level and you're good. It's a circle. It just keeps going over and over and over again. And so equality is never something you reach. It's something that you constantly have to work for over and over. It's never going to stop. Because at the end of the day, these institutions are built they're built to reflect Canada, right? And what is Canada if not like a colonial nation where we're all kind of guests here and not supposed to actually get a main piece of the pie, right? So I think that on the one hand, I think money is very important. A big part of me is like, give us money, give us resources, get out of our way, right? That's a big part of it. But you can't get that from any one institution because there's hurdles everywhere. And until all of these systems start working well together, which they're not designed to do, you may get money from one place, but you're gonna face that wall in the other place. So I think that it's vital that those main pots are divided up more equitably. And I think it's vital that to make up for the years of inequality and being left out, that there be supplementary pots that allow us to pad, the bottom line is, and I'm going through this now with my first scripted feature film that I'm producing and directing myself, is you're always going to need a certain amount of, say, private money or private equity, right? Well, those private people that have money in Canada, for the most part, are going to be white, right? There's very few people of color that have that kind of income, and they're not going to value our stories the way they value white filmmakers' stories. It's just not going to happen. So we need the main pots, and we need supplementary help, because the main pot alone won't be enough, because then you're competing with the white filmmakers who also got that money, and all the other systems are built to support them, not you, right? So I think both are important.
I know we're at the end of time, but I just wanted to see if Kadon had anything final to add. No pressure for the final comment.
No, Amar said everything I was going to say.
Excellent. Thank you all for being with us here today. It's interesting because I will say, having started this job in January, I'm just slowly reconnecting to the industry for whom I'm doing this work. And having you here today to present this to in person is actually tremendously meaningful even for me. It really is fueling me. So thank you for being here and sticking with us through the hour. All of us are trying to do what we're doing. We've personally experienced these things, as you have heard, in our careers. We are trying to now work collectively and contribute and collaborate. And we're always open to hearing from you, to connecting with you. Hopefully we just get to actually see each other more and more, and just keep building all of that community and connection in person again as we're moving out and pushing ourselves out into this industry to not just carve out our own pots and streams, which is useful, but also just downright attack and make our way fully into the main pots now too. So all towards pushing into that main pie now. Thank you so very much. And thank you, Tanya, Amar, and Kadon.